Welcome back, everyone, to week 16. This week, we are looking at China. Again, we went a little bit out of order, but that's okay. We are going to look at the Ming Dynasty through contemporary China. And again, this is quite a lot to cover, so I'm not going to be talking much about the Qin Dynasty. I'll explain kind of culturally what happened during that shift, but we're mostly going to be focusing on the Ming Dynasty. Again, I won't speak a lot about the Republic of China and the art that was produced during that time, but we will be covering in the videos that I'm going to show you a little bit more about contemporary Chinese art. All right, so I just brought this in so you could see all of the dynasties that we've covered and how far we've come. All right, so we're going to be looking at the Ming Dynasty and the transition from the Yuan to the Ming Dynasty. So we're going to see the Chinese rebel against the Yuan. Remember, the Yuan are barbarians, quote unquote. And so the Ming Dynasty is going to reestablish native Chinese rule, so ethnic Chinese rule. And then we're going to see the third Ming Emperor, Zhu Di, establish Beijing as the capital. So there had been a lot of competition between southern capitals and northern capitals. Right? When the Ming take over China, they establish the capital in the south, but Zhu Di takes the capital back north. And in establishing Beijing, which had been used by the Yuan dynasty as their capital, by reestablishing it as the capital, he chooses this place for his main palace, the Forbidden City. Now, for the Forbidden City, I'm going to have you watch a video, and I don't remember if we've seen it already, but hopefully it'll give you some context, right? This is a massive undertaking, the construction of this palace. There's very few palaces around the world that really compare in terms of luxury and scale. What's interesting to note here is we are building upon all of these years, these millennia of Chinese ingenuity, engineering, and aesthetics that we have been learning. So when you look at it, the main building material is going to be wood because this is the main building material of most of East Asia. We're also going to be seeing the use of bracketing systems in terms of structural engineering. We're going to be seeing a lot of the motifs that we've seen before. The use of bright colors in Chinese aesthetic, the reds, the greens, the golds, dragon imagery, all of these are going to come back. Because, of course, the Ming, what they are trying to do is reestablish Chinese aesthetics and tradition to the empire. And of course, they're also trying to legitimize their own rule. And so by establishing themselves and connecting themselves to iconography that had already been established, they are able to do this. And the Forbidden City, as huge as it is, and I visited a couple of years ago, and I started and I was like, I'm going to see the whole thing. I made it through like one hallway. It is huge. You would have had political machinations happening. So again, it's called the Forbidden City because access to the space was very limited. And so again, when we think about, let me go back to the slide, about architecture and who gets to be allowed in what spaces, that's a huge thing when we analyze architecture. And the Forbidden City itself is an entire city, but it's restricted. Who can enter this space? And once you enter, you are basically put in your place. Everything is vast. It's much larger than you. And as you walk towards the throne, the emperor's throne, you are really kind of at the bottom and the emperor's throne is at the top and everything is backlit. So you very much feel like you are coming for an audience with the Son of Heaven. Again, that remember this from way back earlier in the semester where the emperor has the mandate of heaven. So again, he is associating himself with the divine. And you would have come if you were, say, a diplomat, maybe somebody that's coming to do kind of governmental business. This is where you would do this. If you came for an audience with the emperor, this is where it would be done. This is also where you have a lot of different, the extended family of the emperor, the courtesans of the emperor. There's an entire section that's just for courtesans. It's almost like there's little neighborhoods and villages within the space itself. And the reason for this is in true Chinese architectural fashion, this is not one contained palace. Instead, it is made up of separate pavilions. And on a side note, in case you're wondering, oh, well, it was made out of wood. That's lovely. But didn't it burn down? Yes. So some of these buildings burned down several times and had to be reconstructed. And as I was saying, it's not just the structure itself, which is magnificent to look at, but it's also everything that went into it. So everything from the decorative arts to costuming to artwork that would have hung on the walls to carpets, all of these make up the luxurious lifestyle of the Ming emperors. So here is a map. So you have the outer city here, and we're going to take a look at the Temple of Heaven in a minute too. And then in the main inner city itself, you have the imperial city, which we're already restricting access to. And then beyond that, you have the forbidden city itself. Here are some of the original Ming city walls. Of course, the city itself has it's much larger and has superseded these walls, but what's really fascinating is that we still have some of these original walls, and they are in the same design and architectural style that you see on the Ming part of the Great Wall of China that I showed you a couple of weeks ago. And walls are going to be one of those few instances where stone is definitely going to be used because for defensive purposes. Here is a painting of the time, and I don't have the artist attribution. I'm sorry about that. Where we can see kind of the symbolism of the Forbidden City itself, the different stages. And what's really fascinating about the way that it is laid out is that as you walk through it, you are walking through different zones. So it's not like a European building in which you walk into, say, the main lobby or the foyer, and then there are, say, the ballroom is over on this side, and then on this side you have one wing, and then there's another wing, right? We tend to think in European architecture, Western architecture, about wings in a building. Instead, here it's like a progression of time and space, and depending on who you are, is what spaces you can inhabit, but it's very linear in its design. Instead of going, one way or the other, you walk through it as if you're walking through kind of layers of almost like a heavenly city, which is kind of what's being portrayed in this image. Now, the Temple of Heaven is another structure constructed during the Ming Dynasty, and it's actually part of a much larger park, which was just kind of a sacred space during that time. This is what it looks like today. This is why it says restaurant on there. But this is the actual structure itself, and as you can see, it is a temple structure made up of 3 different sections. You can see even today, thankfully, there is this beautiful garden space around the temple itself, so it hasn't been consumed by the modern city. So here we can see some of the detailing of the main temple structure. So a lot of symbolism. Red to symbolize the emperor. Dragon and phoenix motifs. Again, a nod to the emperor. Symbolic offerings inside. Dragon imagery again. Blue to represent the heavens. circular roof to symbolize the sky. And this is a beautiful structure itself because it's circular. And here is an image of the site inside, and now it has been restored, but it is beautiful the way that the colors really pop, and it gives you an idea of what it would have looked like originally. You can see the entire dome on the inside has been painted. And this is very different than what I showed you last week in Japan. And again, you start to recognize the difference in aesthetics. And like I said, they're both equally as beautiful. I mean, look at those dragons painted on the beams themselves, but very different. All right. And what we're going to see here, very similar to in Japan, is the use of brackets. So these structures are not held together by nails. Instead, what they are held together by is this very complicated system of brackets, wooden brackets. And so what's really interesting is that when there's an earthquake, these have a little more leeway and they don't break, they don't have the building collapse. There's a little wiggle room, which is really great. Unfortunately, again, it's all wood, so it does have tendency to burn, but it is incredibly long lasting, structurally speaking. And so it's amazing the amount of weight that these structures are able to bear just using the bracketing system. And this is a beautiful image of the Temple of Heaven. Now, I will say this, the sky is never this blue. But it is, the structure itself, this is what it looks like. So another structure of the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty is known for really putting a lot of infrastructure effort into the new capital of Beijing. Now, stepping aside from architecture, let's look at painting. So I haven't really talked about literati painting very much, although it's been with us since the Song Dynasty. And this type of painting is kind of scholarly painting. It elevated the status of painting from a craft to a real art form, and it separated itself from traditional painting. And in case you're wondering what's traditional painting, at least during the Ming Dynasty, I'll show you in a minute. So these are scholars that often are going to retreat from the cities and kind of go off and live in the forests. They try to express themselves through personal and symbolic imagery. And we're going to see this even more in the Qin Dynasty, where it's really, painting becomes much more personal in a way that is a lot closer to Western painting of that same period, where it's more about the artist expressing himself or herself. So common techniques were unassuming brushstrokes and subtle colors used sparingly. So these are not the bright colors of the court. The landscape was created to convey, again, that personal meaning. And the literati did not create works for public display, but for each other and for themselves. So this is not commercial art. This is very deeply personal art. And you will often see a lot of landscapes because, again, they're kind of leaving the cities to go live in kind of far-flung towns and really communing with nature. So they favored small formats such as hand scrolls, hanging scrolls, as opposed to much larger pieces because, again, they're not for hanging on the palace walls. This way it could also be shown to friends at small gatherings of literati scholar artists. They're usually done in ink. I said, there's sometimes subtle color added, but mostly ink. And the calligraphy is used to describe their meanings, and often they are paired with poems because these literati artists are often also poets, writers, scholars, and so they kind of mix everything together into their pieces. Now, painting under the Ming, so the court painting, is going to be slightly different. So it's going to be founded by Tai Su, who came from a poor, uneducated class. He was a military leader. He grew to distrust intellectuals, such as the literati, And the contrast between the luxury of the court and the austere ideals of the literati is going to continue under the Ming. Now, I mentioned the first part because whenever you're coming from a background where you need to legitimize your rule, say by building a gigantic palace structure, the Forbidden City, or giant temples, Temple of Heaven, what you need to do is make it as big and as like awe-inspiring as possible, and we're going to see that this applies to painting as well. So what we're going to see are pieces like this. This is hundreds of birds admiring peacocks. So it's a large painting on silk. It's painted during the late 15th, early 16th century. And it is a great example of a genre that was very popular during this time, which is the bird and flower genre. I love this genre because you can tell it's the bird and flower genre because there's lots of birds and flowers in there. And it is an homage to birds, of birds to peacocks, and it's symbolic of the homage of court officials to the emperor. So there's always slight propaganda going on with these pieces. But some of the distinguishing characteristics, let me see, there it is closer, of the genre of the birds and flowers genre is that you're still seeing landscapes, but they're very different. You often have this golden background, brownish golden background. You have a lot more use of color and details. And again, the symbolism isn't about your personal experience of nature. Instead, it is veiled symbolism of the emperor and his rule. And I used to play a game with my students where I was like, who can tell me how many birds there are in this piece? There's a lot of birds in this piece. I forgot by now. But the detailing on these is incredible. Very similar to, of course, this is a much larger scale, but the Mogul miniatures that we looked at. So the amount of detailing of each feather and each bird on these court paintings is exquisite. Another type of art form of this period, we're spending a lot of time on the Ming Dynasty because this is really a heyday in terms of arts during the early modern period of China. We're going to see the popular worldwide use of Ming Dynasty ceramics. And this is inevitably why you call your China China, because there is a massive exportation of this beautiful ceramic ware coming from China. It is porcelain with blue glaze, and this blue glaze actually comes from Persia. So there's a lot of trade still going on. And what I wanted to show you is that a lot of these wares were for local, for in China itself. You can see the use of the dragon here. This is obviously for a Chinese customer. But then if you look at this one, it looks very European with those little grapes and the curly cues. Right? It's very early modern European taste. And so what they did, which sounds incredibly modern to us today, is that they looked at their market and they studied their market and they said, oh, this is the type of imagery that this market wants. And so they produced ceramics with that type of imagery and iconography. This one is kind of more for a Western Asia market. But this one in particular is for that Middle East, right, region where you don't have images of humans, animals, that sort of thing, but instead you have these beautiful kind of more calligraphy style vegetative designs that are popular in the area. And so they recreate those, and they often recreate the designs of vessels as well. This, you could immediately guess, was more for a European market and for a Chinese market with those dragons. You also see ceramics using different colors, but that Ming blue and white is the most popular. Now, for the Qin dynasty, and you're wondering what happened to the Ming dynasty. Well, I mean, it's the same story that I've been telling since the beginning of class. There was a peasant uprising because, as you can imagine, if people are living with this amount of luxury, it means most of the population is not. And there are a lot of peasant uprisings during this time due to famine, you know, not having many rights as peasants, uh, a lot of political instability within the Ming dynasty itself. And so you get the Qin dynasty. And this is going to take us all the way to the modern age. So they come from the area of Manchu, which is actually above Korea, above North Korea, what would be North Korea today. And this is the last imperial dynasty before the Republic of China. And the biggest thing that you have to remember about this time period, because we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, is you have more individualistic painters. So you have more literati type painters, and they become kind of the norm. What you're also going to see during this time, and I don't think I have images, unfortunately, but you can look them up in your book, is you are going to see a lot more mixing of Western styles. So you have Italian painters coming in, and French painters, and painters from Britain, and they're all going to influence the Chinese style. You are going to start seeing pieces with a lot more perspective, Western 1 to the 4 point perspective instead of that isometric perspective that we talked about before. A lot more use of oil paints. And emperors are going to depict themselves both in the traditional Chinese style and also in this more Western modern style. Now, unfortunately, the 19th century is not good to China, and it's often called the tragic century for China. In the 18th century, right, the Ming Dynasty, the beginning of the Qin Dynasty, we are going to see that China possesses great economic and cultural power. We've seen this throughout our class. China has been a superpower in terms of economics, culture, military prowess. Right? Uh, but we're going to see power start to shift as the West gains more military power. And this is the era of imperialism and who's able to get where first. Now, as I mentioned with Japan, China is not a pure victim of imperialism because China inflicted imperialism on other regions of Southeast and East Asia. Uh, but they are going to fall prey to the West. So in the 19th century, we're going to see a lot of trade imbalances, which are going to hurt the economy. We're going to see military confrontations with the West, and these are going to impose unequal treaties with China. Important port cities are taken over by Western powers. And this is what I'm talking about. There was never a upright, like, I am now, China is now part of Europe as a colony. It's never colonized in the way that India is, but all of its power, its economic power and political power is slowly stripped away. And we're also going to see a lot of internal rebellions, which continue during this time and are going to weaken China. Now, disasters, a weak state, and a series of rebellions are all going to lead to a weakened China, which is more susceptible to foreign influence. And I'm not going to go into the Opium Wars deeply in this lecture. Maybe I'll put them in a video for you to watch so that you can better understand what these were about. But let's just say that they were catastrophic for the people of China. What happened basically was that the British harvested opium in India and then they brought it to China, and they very much knew that this was addictive, and the people of China became addicted to this opium, and the only way to get it was through the British Empire. And we are going to see how the British then use this as a tool to control the Chinese population. All right. Now we're going to see the end of the Qin dynasty. In 1900s, the Qin dynasty lay in ruins. China was already separating into different factions, and whenever a large empire starts separating into sections, it's really the beginning of the end. And in 1911, the Republic of China is founded. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go deeply into the art of the Republic of China, although it's a fascinating look at the way that China, the Republic of China, used propaganda and art hand in hand. What I am still instead going to focus on, because we have a limited amount of time, is contemporary China, because contemporary Chinese artists are flourishing. Just a couple of years ago, there was a gigantic demand for contemporary Chinese artists in terms of the art market and the art world. There are many avant-garde districts today in China. 798 district in Beijing itself was really cutting edge maybe a couple of years ago. Now it's become a lot more commercialized. But you still see a lot of contemporary art galleries selling really interesting and innovative artwork that, again, like I said with Japan and like I said with India, tap into that cultural history of China while also conversing with the global art styles and aesthetic that are very important if you want to sell your work today in the global art market. And so from this video, you're going to see a lot of different artists kind of working with different media. And I want you to think about the type of issues that these contemporary Chinese artists are tackling. And I'm going to wrap up there. I promised I would make this one not as long as last week's. And I hope that you enjoyed the documentaries I have for you this module. And I will see all of you next week.